Hey people, get ready to crush everyday TOEFL iBT tests for all modules and make your dreams come true. I'm your motivator and I'll be guiding you through the test prep videos. So don't forget to like, share, and subscribe or you'll be missing out on some serious preparation.
Conversation 1. You will hear a conversation. A female student approaches a male computer lab technician for help with statistical analysis software that keeps crashing while she works on a class assignment due the following morning. First, you have some time to look at the 5 questions. Now listen carefully and answer the questions. Excuse me, hi. I was wondering if you could help me. I'm having a really frustrating problem with one of the software programs on these computers.
Sure, I'm Marcus, the lab technician on duty today. What seems to be the issue?
Well, I'm working on my statistics assignment and I need to use Stata for data analysis. But every time I try to run a regression model with my dataset, the program just freezes and then crashes completely. I've already lost about an hour of work.
Oh, that does sound frustrating. Did you get any kind of error message before it crashed, or does it just close without warning?
It usually shows a message that says something about insufficient memory, and then it just shuts down. I've tried restarting the program twice already, but the same thing keeps happening.
Okay, that's helpful. How large is your dataset? Because Stata can have trouble processing very large files on these machines if too many other programs are running simultaneously.
It's about 50,000 observations with around 30 variables. I don't think that's unusually large, is it?
It's not enormous, but it can be demanding depending on the analysis type. Let me check what else is running in the background on this workstation. Ah, I see, there are several other memory-intensive applications still open from the previous user. That's very likely contributing to the problem.
Oh, I didn't even think to check that. I just sat down and logged in.
That happens a lot. I'll close those out for you. I'd also recommend saving your dataset in a compressed format and clearing the workspace before running your regression. That should free up enough memory. Let me also update the Stata license on this machine. It's been a few weeks and there might be a patch that addresses some stability issues.
That would be great. I have a deadline tomorrow morning, so I really need this to work tonight.
Understood. While I'm running the update, you might also want to save your do file to the university's cloud drive rather than the local desktop. We had an incident last month where several students lost their work because the local drives weren't backed up properly.
Really? That's a little alarming. I had no idea that was even a risk. I'll definitely move everything to the cloud drive right now.
It's something the department is actively working to improve. Okay, the update is complete and the background applications are closed. Try running your analysis now and let me know if it goes through.
It's running. And it looks like it's actually going to complete this time. Thank you so much, I was starting to panic.
Great, glad we got it sorted. And if you run into any more issues tonight, I'll be here until 10 o'clock, so don't hesitate to come back.
That is the end of the conversation 1. You now have some time to answer the questions. Conversation 2. You will hear a conversation. A male student visits the university library to consult a female research librarian about finding sufficient peer-reviewed sources for a research paper on international carbon pricing policies. First, you have some time to look at the 5 questions. Now listen carefully and answer the questions.
Hello, excuse me. Are you the research librarian on duty?
Yes, I am. I'm Patricia Gwynn. How can I help you today?
Hi, I'm James. I'm a sophomore in the Environmental Studies program, and I'm working on a research paper about carbon pricing policies in different countries. My professor wants us to use at least 8 peer-reviewed sources, and I'm really struggling to find enough relevant material.
Carbon pricing, that's a particularly active area of research right now. What resources have you tried so far?
I've mostly been using Google Scholar. I found a few articles, but a lot of them are either behind paywalls or they're from 10 or 15 years ago. My professor specifically said the sources need to be from the last 5 years.
Okay, that's good context. Google Scholar is a reasonable starting point, but the university subscribes to several specialized databases that will give you much better access to recent, peer-reviewed material. For environmental policy specifically, I'd especially recommend Web of Science and JSTOR's policy and social science collections.
I've heard of JSTOR, but I honestly didn't know it covered policy topics. I always thought of it as being mainly for the humanities.
That's a common misconception. JSTOR expanded its collections significantly over the past decade and now includes a strong selection of social science and environmental policy journals. That said, for something as current as carbon pricing, Web of Science might actually serve you better because it indexes more recent publications and lets you filter results by publication year and citation count.
Oh, that filtering feature sounds really useful. Can I access those databases from off-campus, or do I need to be physically here in the library?
You can access all of them remotely through the library portal. You just log in with your student credentials. Now, I also want to mention something else. Have you looked at policy briefs from institutions like Resources for the Future or the World Bank? While they aren't peer-reviewed in the traditional academic sense, many professors accept them as credible supplementary sources because they're produced by established research organizations with rigorous review processes.
I hadn't heard of Resources for the Future at all. I'll definitely look into that. But first I really need to lock down those 8 peer-reviewed sources. What search terms would you suggest I start with?
Start broad and then narrow down systematically. Try carbon tax or emissions trading scheme combined with the names of specific regions. European Union, Canada, or China are well-documented cases. You can also use cap and trade as an alternative term. Then apply the database's date filter to restrict results to articles published between 2021 and 2026.
That's really practical. One more question. I found one article that looks absolutely perfect for my argument, but even when I access it through the library portal it says my access is restricted. Is there anything I can do about that?
Absolutely. You can submit what we call an interlibrary loan request, or ILL. The library contacts another institution that holds the article, borrows a digital copy on your behalf, and delivers it to your library account, usually within 1 to 3 business days. You just fill out the request form on the library website.
Wow, I had no idea the library could do that. That's genuinely one of the most useful things I've learned since starting here.
It's honestly one of our most underused services. Most students don't even discover it until they're writing their senior thesis, which is a real shame. Here, let me write down the names of the two databases and the direct link to the ILL request form so you have everything in one place.
Thank you so much, Patricia. This is way more helpful than I was expecting. I feel a lot better about this paper now.
That is the end of the conversation too. You now have some time to answer the questions. Lecture 1. You will hear part of a lecture about history. Silk Road Trade Networks. First, you have some time to look at the 6 questions. Now listen carefully and answer the questions.
Today we're going to talk about the Silk Road, and I want to be clear right from the start that calling it a single road is actually a bit misleading. The Silk Road was not one route but rather an enormous web of overland and maritime trade networks stretching from China in the east all the way to the Mediterranean in the west. These networks were active for well over 1,000 years, roughly from the 2nd century BCE through the 15th century CE. Now, most people assume the Silk Road was primarily about silk, and yes, silk was a major Chinese export that gave the network its modern name, a name actually coined by a German geographer, Ferdinand von Richthofen, in 1877. But the trade goods were remarkably diverse. From China flowed porcelain, paper, and gunpowder. From Central Asia came horses, glassware, and gold. From the Mediterranean world came olive oil, wine, and wool textiles. And critically, the routes also carried ideas. Buddhism spread from India into Central Asia and China along these very corridors. Islam later traveled the same paths westward and eastward. One important structural point: most merchants didn't travel the entire length of the route. Instead, goods passed through a series of middlemen, traders who specialized in one segment of the journey. The Sogdians, a Central Asian people based around the city of Samarkand, were particularly dominant as intermediaries from roughly the 4th through the 8th century CE. They established merchant colonies as far east as China and as far west as Byzantium. Their commercial letters, discovered in an abandoned watchtower on the western edge of the Gobi Desert in 1907, are among our most direct documentary evidence of how this trade actually functioned day to day.
Student, Professor Merritt, you mentioned maritime routes. Were those considered part of the Silk Road too, or is that a separate thing?
Great question. Scholars do include the sea lanes, sometimes called the Maritime Silk Road, under the broader umbrella. The maritime routes connected Chinese ports like Guangzhou and Xuanzhou with Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the East African coast. By the Tang and Song dynasties, sea trade had actually begun to outpace overland trade in volume, partly because ships could carry much heavier cargo far more cheaply than camel caravans crossing deserts and mountain passes. So the two systems coexisted and complemented each other, though the overland routes remain strategically important for certain goods and diplomatic missions. I also want to emphasize that the Silk Road's significance was not purely economic. These routes were vectors for disease as well. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the mid-14th century, is widely believed to have traveled westward along Central Asian trade corridors before reaching the Black Sea ports. So when we study the Silk Road, we're really studying the arteries of the pre-modern globalized world in all its complexity. Commerce, culture, religion, and even epidemiology all moved along the same paths.
That is the end of the lecture 1. You now have some time to answer the questions. Lecture 2. You will hear part of a lecture about architecture. Gothic cathedral design. First, you have some time to look at the 6 questions. Now listen carefully and answer the questions.
Alright, let's shift our focus today to Gothic cathedral architecture, which emerged in northern France in the 12th century and spread across Europe over the next 300 years. What I want to do today is walk you through the key structural innovations that define Gothic design, because Gothic cathedrals are not just beautiful, they are extraordinary feats of medieval engineering that solved a very specific structural problem. How do you build a stone church that is both extremely tall and full of light? The predecessor to the Gothic style was Romanesque architecture. Romanesque churches used thick, heavy stone walls to bear the weight of the roof, and because those walls had to be so massive, windows could only be small. The result was a dark, cave-like interior. Gothic architects, starting with Abbot Suger's reconstruction of the Abbey of Saint Denis near Paris around 1140, began developing a radically different structural system. The key innovations were 3, the pointed arch, the ribbed vault, and most critically, the flying buttress. Let me explain how these 3 elements work together. A traditional semicircular arch pushes its weight outward in a wide arc, meaning the walls on either side have to be very thick to resist that lateral thrust. A pointed arch, by contrast, directs the load more steeply downward, reducing the outward thrust considerably. Ribbed vaults allowed builders to concentrate the weight of the ceiling along specific stone ribs, rather than distributing it across the entire vault surface. This meant the wall space between those ribs didn't need to bear weight, and so it could be opened up with large windows. But here's the remaining problem: even with pointed arches and ribbed vaults, some lateral thrust still had to go somewhere. That's where the flying buttress came in. A flying buttress is an arched stone prop that reaches from a freestanding outer pier across open air to meet the upper wall of the cathedral, catching that outward thrust and redirecting it down into the ground. It literally looks like a stone arm reaching out to catch the wall before it falls.
Student, Professor Beaumont, so the flying buttress is on the outside of the building? I always thought buttresses were just decorative.
That's a really common assumption, and honestly it's understandable because later Gothic buildings did elaborate their flying buttresses with decorative stonework, pinnacles and carved details, to the point where they look purely ornamental. But no, their primary function is absolutely structural. They are load-bearing elements. In fact, without the flying buttress, you simply could not build walls thin enough and tall enough to accommodate those enormous stained glass windows that are so iconic in cathedrals like Notre Dame de Paris or Chartres Cathedral. The decoration came later, almost as a way of beautifying something that was there for purely practical reasons. This is actually a recurring theme in Gothic architecture, structural necessity and aesthetic ambition become inseparable. Now, I want to say a word about stained glass, because it's central to understanding the theological intent behind this architectural system. Abbot Suger wrote extensively about his philosophy of sacred light, the idea, drawn from the theology of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, that divine light was a manifestation of God himself, and that filling a sacred space with colored, filtered light could elevate the soul toward the divine. So the entire structural ingenuity of Gothic architecture, the pointed arches, the ribbed vaults, the flying buttresses, was ultimately in service of flooding the interior with as much light as possible. Engineering and theology were deeply intertwined in the Gothic cathedral.
That is the end of the lecture 2. You now have some time to answer the questions. Lecture 3. You will hear part of a lecture about psychology. Memory consolidation. First, you have some time to look at the 6 questions. Now listen carefully and answer the questions.
Today we're going to dig into memory consolidation, a process that is absolutely fundamental to how we learn, yet one that most people know very little about. At the most basic level, consolidation refers to the process by which newly acquired memories are stabilized and transformed into long-term memories. It's not instantaneous. When you learn something new, the memory is initially fragile, easily disrupted by interference or physical trauma. Consolidation is the mechanism by which that fragile trace gets hardened, in both a molecular sense at the level of individual neurons and a systems-level sense involving large networks of brain structures. Researchers generally distinguish between 2 levels of consolidation. The first is synaptic consolidation, which happens relatively quickly, within hours of learning. This involves molecular changes at the synapse, proteins are synthesized, receptor densities change, and new synaptic connections are strengthened. The critical concept here is long-term potentiation, or LTP, the strengthening of synaptic connections through repeated stimulation. LTP is widely considered the cellular mechanism underlying memory storage. The second level is systems consolidation, which operates on a much longer timescale, weeks, months, or even years. This is the process by which memories initially dependent on the hippocampus gradually become represented in the neocortex and no longer require the hippocampus for retrieval. Now, sleep is arguably the most important environmental factor in memory consolidation, and this is where things get really interesting. During sleep, particularly during slow-wave sleep and REM sleep, the brain replays experiences from the waking day. In the hippocampus, sequences of neural firing that occurred during learning are reactivated during slow-wave sleep in a compressed, faster form. This replay is thought to drive the transfer of memory representations from the hippocampus to the neocortex. Essentially, sleep is doing the defiling work that moves information into permanent storage. REM sleep, on the other hand, seems particularly important for emotional memory consolidation and for integrating new information with existing knowledge schemas.
Student, Professor Osei, does that mean pulling an all-nighter before an exam is actually counterproductive, even if you feel like you studied a lot?
Exactly, and the research supports that intuition very strongly. Studies have shown that sleep deprivation after learning dramatically impairs subsequent memory retention. In one well-known paradigm, participants who learned a set of word pairs and then slept performed significantly better on a recall test the next day than participants who learned the same material but stayed awake. The problem with all-nighters isn't just fatigue, it's the absence of the consolidation window that sleep provides. You might encode the material during studying, but without sleep, the synaptic and systems-level consolidation processes are curtailed. In effect, you're filling a leaky bucket. One more concept I want to introduce before we move on is reconsolidation. For a long time, scientists believed that once a memory was consolidated, it was stable, locked in, essentially permanent unless a person suffered brain damage. But research in the early 2000s, particularly by Karine Nader and colleagues, demonstrated that retrieving a memory actually makes it temporarily unstable again. After retrieval, the memory must go through a new round of consolidation, called reconsolidation, to be restabilized. This has fascinating implications for treating conditions like PTSD, because it suggests that under the right conditions, retrieved traumatic memories can be modified before they reconsolidate, potentially reducing their emotional power.
That is the end of the Lecture 3. You now have some time to answer the questions. That is the end of the TOEFL iBT listening test. You now have some time to review your answers.
Hey people, how was your test? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or you'll be missing out on some serious fun. See you tomorrow!